If you are starting to write your first invoices, you might have a few questions, and there are some things you should pay attention to. What exactly those are, I will show you in this video. So that we can take a look at what a legally compliant invoice should look like, I will share my screen with you. Basically, you might wonder why you should create an invoice according to legal requirements. Essentially, the first reason is actually quite obvious. Your customer will usually only pay you once they have a correct invoice. It is important for the customer to have a legally compliant invoice because they can claim the specified VAT amount as input tax in their VAT advance return. This cannot be done with an incorrect invoice. I have also recorded a separate video on how the VAT advance notification works, which you can find linked in the top right now. Basically, if you receive an incorrect invoice, you are always entitled to request an invoice correction and have a legal right to a corrected invoice. What you must not do is to personally correct the invoice you received and then claim it in the VAT advance return. But first, let's definitely take a look at how you write your invoices. It should be mentioned again that while there are legal requirements and regulations regarding what you should include on an invoice, there is no regulation on which tool or software you should use to write an invoice. This means that, theoretically, it would also be acceptable if you simply take a sheet of paper and write all the invoice details on it with a pen, and then it would also be a proper invoice. I can't really recommend doing it that way in everyday life, but legally speaking, it would be perfectly fine. We are here in the web interface of Contest, and for some time now, it has been possible to create invoices using the Contest web app. And that's exactly what we will take a look at, so that we can then examine the individual invoice items that should also be included on each of your invoices. Now, we will take a look at the invoices, go to the preview, and this invoice is basically already issued. And yes, it's best to start right at the top. It's always important that your invoice has a number. Your invoice needs a sequential number. That means you don't have to start at 1. You can also start at 1,000, like 326, and then the next number would be 327, 328, and so on. You can also theoretically include numbers and figures in this invoice. The only important thing is that this number, continuous, is. And continuous means that you have no gaps in the middle. Because if you were to start with invoice number 1, for example, and then the next one is 5, it could happen that the tax office during an audit looks at the invoices and wonders where invoices number 2, 3, and 4 are, as some are missing. And then under certain circumstances, the tax office may start estimating and effectively add more revenue to your account, which means you have to pay more taxes even though those invoices never existed. To avoid this, you should always use a sequential invoice number. Additionally, you should of course fill in your customer on your invoice. Here is Hans Meyer at New Street 12 in 12345 Berlin in Germany. It is important here, as mistakes often occur, to provide the legally correct description of your customer. If it is Hans Meyer, that means if it is a sole proprietorship, then Hans Meyer is the correct designation. If it is a GmbH, the absolutely correct name of your customer, and your customer must be stated here. If it is Hans Meyer GmbH Co. KG, then you cannot delete anything. It must state Hans Meyer GmbH & Co. KG. Additionally, your name and address must be included. Here on the right side, it should say Melchior Neumann, taxes contest.com. The phone number is not legally required, nor is the email address, but the address, which is Kastanienallee B in Berlin, Germany, is. It is important that you fill in your own address. It is also particularly important for sole proprietorships. I see this repeatedly, that a company name is made up here. This means that if you are registered as a sole proprietorship, you cannot write Quick IT here, meaning you cannot use your business name. You are definitely welcome to use the brand name and can add it to your invoice, but as a sole proprietorship that is not registered in the commercial register, your business must always be named after you, and you cannot omit that. Additionally, you must include either your tax number or your VAT identification number on your invoices. In this case, I have provided both numbers, which is not necessary. It is sufficient to list one of these numbers on your invoice. Personally, I would always recommend from practice that you provide the VAT identification number, because I mentioned this in an earlier video, which I will link here again, that the tax number is something like the internal reference number for you at the tax office, and these might be information and data you do not want to send publicly to all your customers, such as the reference numbers you have with the tax office. To avoid this, you can always use the VAT identification number. With this VAT identification number, it is not possible to draw conclusions about you or to request information from the tax office. And that's why I always recommend that if you have a VAT identification number, choose it to include on the invoice. Another very important legal requirement is the date. Each of your invoices needs a date. This is not a big surprise, but indeed, an invoice without a date is also not legally valid. Additionally, you should of course specify what the invoice is for. In this case, it is social media consulting for YouTube, specifically 25 hours at $100, which results in a net amount with a VAT rate of 19%. And here are several details that are important. First, you need to list the item, meaning what this invoice is actually for. The Value Added Tax Act refers to the customary term in terms of type and quantity of delivered goods and the scope and nature of the service. This is the case. When you write, for example, social media consulting for YouTube here, I have also definitely listed a travel expense flat rate or a reallocation of travel expenses. When it comes to the recharging of travel expenses, frequent mistakes often occur because the wrong VAT rate is often chosen. I recently made a video about this, and I will link it for you now in the top right corner. Please take a look at this if you want to continue calculating travel expenses. Additionally, you should list the net amounts, which has been done here, once, for 2001.50, and the applicable VAT rate. This is stated individually for each item, in this case, 19. We have the amount of 2650 net plus VAT and the VAT amount, resulting in a total gross invoice. You should also present this in a very detailed and comprehensive manner, and not just write a gross total amount, and then clearly state that it includes all taxes or contains 19% VAT, as you should always list the net total invoice amount. The detailed breakdown by tax rates, the applicable tax rate, and the tax amount in detail. This is all derived from Section 14 of the VAT Act, which states that it must be itemized separately on each individual invoice. Furthermore, and this is often forgotten, a date of service should be included on the invoice. A performance date usually only requires the month, and it is generally sufficient if you fill in a sentence, as I have listed at the very bottom here. The service date corresponds to the invoice date. This is usually sufficient. What also works well is if you have, for example, a consulting service or a service that you include the month in the description of the service. For example, I could list social media consulting for YouTube in June 2021 as an item, and I will write an invoice for that. This sufficiently fulfills the legal requirement of the service period in order to completely and absolutely meet the criteria. However, you should not forget, even though there is no legal obligation to do so, your own bank account details. That means, in addition to this information, you should provide your own bank account details. I hope this short video was helpful to you. If you have any further questions, please leave us a comment under this video. Additionally, you should definitely subscribe to the channel. You can do that here, or we have more videos recorded that you can find, for example, here or here.